The IDF eliminated Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar, and Israel put forward its own conditions for withdrawing from Gaza. We are talking about this today with David Sharp, a military observer from Israel. David, hello.
Albina, good evening.
The elimination of the leader of Hamas, Sinwar, what is it about now? That is, this is really such unexpected news. And why, say, didn't the IDF do it earlier?
This is an interesting question, worth $1 trillion. There will be a lot of talk about this in the near future. I think that even in books of a historical nature, something is still unknown. But there are certain things that can be said. Yahya Sinwar has been the main organizer and inspirer since October 7th. He and the commander of Hamas militant wing, Mohammed Dev, who was killed earlier this year, were the masterminds of this massacre, the bloodiest massacre for the Jewish people since the Holocaust, if we are talking about such a one-day event, although, by the way, many non-Jews, foreign citizens, and all kinds of people died. So, Sinwar was the highest priority target, along with other Hamas leaders in Gaza, outside Gaza. Since then, almost all the top leaders in Gaza, some not in Gaza, have been killed, including the first and second numbers of the external leadership of Hamas, Salah al-Aruri and Ismail Haniyeh. But Sinwar remained elusive. There were various rumors about where he was. We are talking about open information, not about what the special services knew. But everything looked like this. Or the security services can't find Sinwar. And then it was, let's say, not even a matter of the special services, but of the location that could be hit. Since Israel does not control much of Gaza, Israel, according to its strategy, does not. So, either they could not find him, or they could find him, but due to the fact that he was surrounded by hostages as a pawned account, he was not touched. That is, there were two such versions. And today, or rather, yesterday, what happened yesterday just shed light on something. It became known that when 6 hostages were found dead in one of the Hamas tunnels in August, 6 terrorist hostages were found to have been shot dead. As it turned out, DNA tests in the area around what was happening there and where showed that their Yahya Sinwar was nearby. That is, these 6 who were killed were a specific human shield for Sinwar. And, apparently, he, realizing that the army was approaching, and it was not difficult to hear the engines of the tanks that were walking on the surface, although he was 20 meters underground, they realized that they had to leave, decided to kill the hostages, and they themselves disappeared. Sinwar and his entourage hid somewhere nearby in an area that could be called such a gray zone. That is, it is not that Israel controls it completely, but the army is operating there, making raids, and there are Israeli positions nearby. Precisely because there was an indication that Sinwar and other Hamas leaders were relatively nearby. Active operations in this place, we are talking about the city of Rafah, and the proximity of the close border from Egypt continued, although they were not very active. And so, as it sometimes happens, unlike most cases when the leaders of terrorist organizations are searched for by intelligence, and they are destroyed or captured as a result of specific targeted operations, in this case there was a systemic moment, because active operations continued in this area, based on the fact that there may be valuable persons here. However, in fact, if we are already talking about the micro level, the liquidation of Sinwar was semi-accidental. Soldiers, cadets, a battalion consisting of cadets of the infantry school. The infantry school is a course for squad leaders. Under the cover of fighters who are cadets of the school of tank commanders, they carried out patrol raids in this semi-gray or gray zone. An infantry patrol discovered 3 militants and called for tank fire. Tank fire hit the building where these 3 were. And then a corpse was found on the spot with a very striking resemblance to their Sinwar. Naturally, after that, fingerprints, DNA samples, dental scans were taken, and all this data was in Israel. Naturally, since Sinwar was in an Israeli prison, there was a quick identification and a corresponding result. Israel's target is the man on whom everything has literally converged lately on the Hamas leadership in Gaza and in the Hamas leadership abroad, because he was chosen, an unprecedented case, after the killing in Tehran of Ismail Haniyeh, the head of Hamas's Politburo. The heads of Hamas Politburo elected Sinwar as the general leader, despite the fact that he was in such a semi-clandestine state in the Gaza Strip. A lot has changed now, at least on a personal level, on a symbolic level. In Israel, hopes have now risen sharply that the chance of an exchange of hostages that Hamas has left is generally accepted, that about 50 of the 101 hostages alive are still alive. It was I who did not put it very well. But nevertheless, Sinwar was the most important obstacle on the way to making a particular deal. And now, without it, this vacuum and chaos in the leadership of Hamas will be added, and it will be possible to move in the direction of an exchange of hostages and in general all sorts of important achievements of a practical nature. I personally would not be a great optimist. There is no need to rush, especially when they really have a serious power vacuum. In fact, the entire Hamas leadership in Gaza, except for Sinwar's brother and another top military commander, has been destroyed. In general, a landmark event took place. It is one of the components of the overall success in the war against the militants, but the war is not over.
That is, it is not yet possible to say that this conflict is coming to an end and that, in principle, there is not much left. I am referring to the conflict between Hamas and the IDF.
Of course not. First, the conflict is global in nature. This is a conflict of decades, a conflict since the founding of the State of Israel. That is, during these years, it acquires different shades, different directions. Sometimes there are serious lulls. Sometimes people console themselves with hopes. But in general, the conflict is, I would say, almost eternal. We need to face the truth. As for the current situation, perhaps the elimination of Sinwar is approaching a certain stage that can be called a solution. But the solution, of course, is not a problem at the global level, but a solution at the level of this war that Sinwar started on October 7th. However, Israel has critical demands that will not be abandoned, and these demands must be accepted, either diplomatically accepted, or continue as they have been. I mean that Hamas cannot raise its heads in Gaza. That is, Israel must have guarantees that Hamas does not pose a serious threat to Israel. What happened on October 7th, not only nothing of the kind, but even 100 times smaller in scale, is absolutely unacceptable for Israel today. If there are no international guarantees, and of a practical nature, and who, if not the Ukrainians, knows what guarantees that are not of a practical nature are? Of course, I would like to remind you of the Budapest Memorandum. So, either you and your own armed forces are engaged in guarantees, or some mechanism that is ready to give these very guarantees 100%. Sinwar's departure from the arena is, of course, a landmark event. This is the figure on whom a lot of things converged. It is believed that it was he who showed particular stubbornness in everything related to his unwillingness to make a deal and putting forward absolutely unacceptable demands for Israel. But now the question is, first, who will take his place? Will Hamas's position change? There is some optimism about this. But I would not rush to draw conclusions until we hear the answer. In any case, this is one of the most important events of this war, and there were enough important events, and on different fronts, in this war. And important events are still ahead, whether it is an Israeli strike on Iran, and it will not take place in the near future, and whether it is a continuation of everything that is happening now. As for the fighting in Gaza, and, of course, the fate of the hostages,
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that we will save the lives and allow those who laid down their arms and freed the hostages in Gaza to leave. As far as I understand, we are talking here about members of the Hamas group and the release of hostages. How can this happen?
This, by the way, is a very interesting moment. We are watching its development right now. In general, from the very beginning, from October 7th, Israel made every effort, I emphasize, colossal efforts, to search for hostages and to release them. And efforts of all kinds, starting from a situation where it is possible to free hostages by force as part of classic special operations, including operations that are not quite classical, but, for example, bribing and persuading those who have hostages in their hands. And there was at least one such episode when it was possible to free a hostage girl, let's say, not quite by force, although the details of this operation are still prohibited from publication. Moreover, those who are holding hostages, including families in Gaza, specifically terrorists of Hamas and other terrorist organizations, have been offered amnesty, colossal money and safe passage, and whatever. That is, nevertheless, despite all this, the success was very relative. No one came, as they say, with hostages, received a sum of money and went home. However, today they hope that the situation has changed somewhat. The overwhelming majority of Hamas military formations have been defeated. Let's put it this way, 95%, I mean not destroyed, but defeated. We are talking about formations, only 2 battalions out of 24 are not defeated, but battered. And that's because they operate in places where, as it is commonly believed, there are many hostages, and, most importantly, numerous civilians have been moved there, and there is, so to speak, a humanitarian component. Life in the Gaza Strip for the locals, let's say, is not particularly sweet. The material damage is very large. In other words, they have accumulated very, very serious problems, very, very serious losses. And the departure of this charismatic leader, on the one hand. On the other hand, one that served as an obstacle to various kinds of compromises can theoretically, I emphasize, theoretically, make certain people more accommodating. Especially at the moment when this centralized control has long been violated in many places, it is possible to induce someone to take certain actions to greater compliance. Someone may even betray their own path. Because if someone frees hostages for money, then this is not what their commanders counted on. Today, they will try to use this principle of forging while the iron is hot to the maximum. In my opinion, it should be used in parallel with the maximum military onslaught and such information processing. This is what your leader has brought you to, Gaza and Hamas in particular, and Gaza in general. He was killed. He hid in a hole with a sum of money, died not as a hero, but as a person who was persecuted. However, this is quite a propaganda cliché, but it also works. And to hope for the best in everything that concerns the acquiescence and, perhaps, the acquiescence of someone at the individual level. This is what Netanyahu voiced, this is what they will try to use at other levels. How successful this will be is not clear, but this attempt must be made.
Is this a response to the United States' request to improve the humanitarian situation in Gaza? A few days ago, Israel said that it was considering demands from partners. And at that point, the United States threatened to reduce aid supplies. As I understand it, we are talking about weapons. And this point from comprehensive assistance if necessary to a reduction in arms supplies. Where is the line here? To what extent is the United States really a powerful partner for Israel now?
The United States is a powerful partner. Moreover, by and large, it is the United States that is almost the only one. President Macron certainly cannot be called a partner, nor can many others. Those who have imposed a de facto embargo on Israel, such as the Italian Prime Minister, have not been ashamed to say even aloud that she has done so since October 7th. That is, not even later, when some, I don't know, justified or unjustified claims against Israel arose, namely from October 7th, from the moment of the massacre. No matter what happens. However, no one in Israel had any illusions about the Italians and the overwhelming majority of European leaders. The point, however, is different. Relations with the Americans are specific, important, and complex. The Americans have their own interests, which, especially in the pre-election period, often do not coincide with the Israeli ones. On the other hand, unfortunately, Israel's dependence on the Americans is great. Perhaps it was necessary to do it for many years in such a way that this dependence was less. It would still be there, but it would be smaller. And today, of course, in many situations, it is necessary to take into account the opinion of the United States. Somewhere to a lesser extent, and somewhere not at all. For example, if Israel had taken into account the opinion of the United States, had not advanced in Rafah, then Sinwar had not occupied Rafah and the border with Egypt, things would have been much worse, and Sinwar would have been alive. And I can give many interesting examples of this kind. On the other hand, there are the demands of the United States regarding the northern part of Gaza. The situation is delicate. I think that in the end, a significant part of these requirements will be satisfied. Although, if we talk about the concepts and what would be necessary, let's put it this way, the Americans are mistaken in many ways, and it would not be necessary to do some of the things that are required. But these are nuances. And yes, Israel is missing something from the United States. I am referring to the elements of an arms embargo. For example, there is still an undelivered package of bombs weighing 900 kilograms, and this is a very important component of Israeli military power. Aerial bombs and their active use. The Americans are very actively using this tool. On the one hand, there are arms supplies, on the other hand, there is a partial embargo. And yes, a threat was voiced that if certain measures were not taken within a month regarding the northern part of Gaza, where they wanted to resolve the issue in comparison with what had been done so far, in a more radical way, to completely cleanse part of this territory from terrorists, which was not done as part of combined arms raids, because the territory was left, respectively, to those who were there, raised their heads or returned there. So, within the framework of these strategies, there is a slightly different approach. I hope they will find the golden mean in everything related to cooperation between the United States. Unfortunately, this is a classic example of addiction. When you are not able to provide yourself with certain weapons, ammunition, sometimes you have to listen to what you would not like to listen to. The Americans use this tool to the fullest. They use it to one degree or another in relation to Ukraine, and the Ukrainians are also well aware of this.
Yes, I absolutely agree with you, and now our country is looking for opportunities to end the war as soon as possible. Volodymyr Zelensky proposed a victory plan for consideration by both Joe Biden and European leaders today. The goal of the plan is to end the war in 2025. How do you assess such prospects and opportunities for Ukraine, based on the current situation on the battlefield, and based on the reactions that appear in the information space of European leaders?
First of all, we know, relying on open sources, of course, some of them, but in fact we do not know many details of the proposed plan. And it is not for nothing that it says about secret protocols and applications. The plan, as far as can be implied, is multifaceted. By and large, it is about proposing steps that Ukraine's partners and allies should take to ensure that Russia is forced to peace to a significant extent. And here we come to the most important thing. Some of the requests and demands that are set out in the plan have so far, at least, not been very acceptable to Ukraine's partners for a variety of reasons. Fear of escalation, or because they do not agree with them or consider them not realistic enough. This is a very important point. That is, in order for something to be implemented, decision-makers must change their minds and their approach. This is the first and most important thing. And among other things, it is also important to understand that when we talk about a situation without achieving complete victory on the battlefield, and now we are not talking about this in the short term, there is a second side, there is also Russia. Russia can be very seriously, if desired, especially if the West makes appropriate efforts, you can put serious pressure, you can provide much more assistance to Ukraine in terms of military, you can take certain steps, but even with all that it will be painful and threatening for Russia. We are now thinking hypothetically. All the same, it depends on Russia whether to make certain concessions to a significant extent or not. Does the West have the tools? I will not go into the details of the plan now, especially since we do not know many whether the West has economic levers of influence on Russia and levers of military assistance to Ukraine. That would improve the situation and put more pressure on Russia? Of course, it does. The whole question is how much Ukraine's main partners, primarily the United States, will want to take these steps. Until now, unfortunately, the approach of Western countries, despite extensive large-scale assistance to Ukraine, without which, we must face the truth, Ukraine would not have withstood them. Yet their approach was that this is not our war. That is, we are helping Ukraine. This is very important, but this is not a war that we are waging directly. If this approach had approached this level, which I define in this way, the situation could have been better, and then it would have been possible to talk about the implementation of certain plans, I would say, not victory, but an end to the war on favorable terms or, let's say, on acceptable terms. As for the hostilities, they do not give what is needed today. Without a sharp increase in Western assistance and without certain lessons and measures being learned, and the measures already taken, in fact, by the Ukrainian authorities, the Ukrainian command, in order for the current forces to maintain victory on the battlefield, all kinds of measures are needed. And a lot depends on one thing. And here we move on, in fact, to the main thing. Elections in the United States are the most important event for the implementation or non-implementation of any plans. Whoever wins the election, what happens in the coming months and years will be largely determined by that person. And, in fact, it will be necessary to start from the choice in the United States when we talk about the prospects for ending the war, about the prospects for increasing aid and various scenarios for the development of events.
You know, there is a very interesting point here. President Biden recently said that he was ready to negotiate with the axis of evil. In your opinion, to what extent are negotiations with evil? He means Russia and, possibly, some other countries. To what extent can these negotiations be effective? And in your opinion, in addition to official diplomacy, are there any behind-the-scenes agreements being held in parallel now? And which ones?
I will assume an agreement. This is an interesting point. An agreement is one thing, but contacts and negotiations are another. Of course, we do not know anything about the agreements. To assume that some negotiations and contacts are underway is a completely logical assumption. Moreover, the United States maintains contacts with Russia in one way or another. I do not even rule out that certain negotiations and contacts may be between Russia and Ukraine. After all, the fact is that when negotiations were held in terms of prisoner exchange deals, we remember the grain deal, we remember the beginning of the war, when negotiations were held. There are also secret negotiations. History knows a lot of such events. I am not hinting at anything, I am just illustrating that nothing of the kind can be ruled out. Especially if we are talking about contacts between the United States and Russia. Moreover, regarding contacts with the axis of evil, the current administration, and not only it, has never hidden such intentions. For example, with Iran, the United States is constantly striving to reach a so-called new nuclear deal, to reach some agreements that will lead to limiting Iran's nuclear potential and the ability to create a nuclear bomb. That is, the Americans do not hide the fact that the current Biden administration is super preferable for them, and vice versa. The military option, the option of suffocating sanctions, does not actually exist. The approach, in my opinion, is quite problematic, because the countries that represent the axis of evil understand the language of force to a significant extent. I would say that this military solution does not necessarily have to be implemented in practice, but the threat of the use of force, the threat of the use of suffocating sanctions and the real use of suffocating sanctions are those life-giving methods that work much better than appeasement and attempts to persuade, and the promise of all kinds of carrots. So, of course, they are striving for negotiations. But can negotiations lead to success? But in order for there to be any success in the negotiations, it is necessary that the interests of the parties to the negotiations more or less coincide. Theoretically, this is possible. In practice, we need to wait for the result. So far, as we can see, there is no result.
Yes, you are absolutely right. Unfortunately, so far, the partners, let's say, do not have any specific reaction to Volodymyr Zelensky's victory plan. The United States also provided us with a military aid package, but did not respond to the victory plan either. Unfortunately, the situation is still like this. We continue to monitor, and we are also monitoring the situation in Israel. Thank you very much for joining this stream. David Sharp, a military observer from Israel. Thank you, and all the best.